small, quiet town of Willow Creek had always been a place where life moved slowly, almost predictably. With its tree-lined streets and close-knit community, it was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's business. The Wheeler family was no exception. Mark and Emily Wheeler were the epitome of a loving couple, always seen together, laughing and enjoying each other's company. They had been married for 5 years, and their lives seemed perfect. Emily had recently discovered she was pregnant, and this news had filled their home with joy and excitement. It was a dream come true for the couple, and they could already picture their future with their first child in tow. Their 17-year-old son, Robert, however, was not as enthusiastic about the news. On the surface, Robert appeared to be a typical teenager, quiet, reserved, and somewhat withdrawn, but his behavior had been changing in subtle ways that no one seemed to notice. He had always been a bit of an introvert, preferring the company of books and his own thoughts over socializing with friends. Yet his once predictable routine had begun to shift. He had become increasingly distant, withdrawing from family activities and spending long hours alone in his room. Emily and Mark attributed this behavior to the typical challenges of adolescence. After all, every teenager goes through phases, and this was just one of those times when Robert wanted his space. But as the months passed, there was an undercurrent of tension in the house. Robert had been an only child for most of his life, and the thought of sharing his parents' love and attention with a new sibling began to stir something within him. The idea of having to compete for his parents' attention with a baby was something Robert found difficult to accept. His jealousy grew as Emily's pregnancy progressed, and it was evident to anyone who paid close attention that he resented the changes happening in the family. But no one seemed to understand the depth of his feelings. Emily, in particular, remained blissfully unaware of the emotional turmoil brewing within her son. Mark, too, was consumed by the excitement of becoming a father again. His attention was fixed on Emily, and he often spent his evenings helping her prepare for the arrival of their child. They painted the nursery, purchased baby clothes, and decorated the house with items for the baby's room. These were the things Emily had always dreamed of, and Mark was determined to be the supportive, loving husband she needed during this special time. Yet, for Robert, it was a different story. Every passing day seemed to intensify his feelings of alienation. He felt invisible in his own home, as if his presence no longer mattered. His parents' focus was solely on the impending arrival of the baby, and Robert found it difficult to find a place for himself in the family's plans. The resentment he felt toward Emily grew stronger, though he could not articulate it clearly. He would often isolate himself in his room, avoiding eye contact with his parents, and sometimes he would disappear for hours at a time, roaming the town aimlessly. His mental state began to deteriorate. Thoughts of anger and frustration consumed him, and the more he internalized these feelings, the more isolated he became. His once harmless grudge against his sister soon morphed into something darker. Robert couldn't fathom a life in which he was no longer the center of attention. The baby was going to take everything from him: his parents' love, their time, their affection, and that thought haunted him day and night. But in the midst of all this, no one saw the warning signs. No one understood the depth of Robert's internal struggle. Everyone, including Emily and Mark, believed that once the baby arrived, things would settle down. They had no idea that Robert's quiet, hidden anger would soon explode into something horrific, changing their family forever. As Emily's pregnancy advanced, the Wheeler household became a hub of activity and preparation. There was an air of anticipation, with baby showers, doctor's appointments, and a steady flow of visitors bringing gifts and congratulations. Emily was glowing with joy, and Mark, always supportive, eagerly took on the task of preparing their home for the new arrival. He spent weekends assembling furniture, setting up the nursery, and helping Emily with anything she needed. The two were so absorbed in their excitement that they didn't notice the growing rift between them and their son. Robert, who had always been a quiet and reserved young man, started to act differently. His mood swings became more pronounced, and he became increasingly withdrawn. At first, Emily and Mark chalked it up to the typical teenage rebellion, assuming that Robert was simply adjusting to the idea of having a baby in the house. They thought it was just a phase, something he would grow out of once the baby arrived. They were wrong. Robert's jealousy of the unborn child grew with each passing day. He was once the only child, the center of his parents' world, and now he was being pushed aside. The attention that was once focused on him had shifted entirely to Emily and the baby. He could no longer ignore the way his parents' conversations revolved around the pregnancy. His father would talk about how excited he was to be a father again, while Emily would constantly speak about baby names, nursery colors, and the future. All of it made Robert feel insignificant, as if he no longer mattered. But it wasn't just the attention that he craved, it was the love. Robert had always struggled to express his feelings, but deep down he longed for his parents' affection. With Emily's pregnancy, it felt like he was invisible. The more he saw Emily basking in the glow of her pregnancy, the more resentful he became. He couldn't stand the way his parents doted on her, showering her with love and support, while he was left to fend for himself. His resentment toward Emily reached new heights when he overheard his parents discussing the baby's gender reveal. Mark was thrilled to learn that it would be a girl, while Emily, although equally excited, seemed preoccupied with other concerns. Robert, however, couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one more reason for his parents to focus all their energy on Emily and the child. He became convinced that his life would never be the same again, that he would forever be relegated to the shadows of his parents' attention. Robert began to withdraw further, avoiding conversations with his parents and retreating to his room for hours at a time. He spent most of his days lost in his thoughts, consumed by a dark, growing rage. He resented his sister for taking away everything that he once held dear. In the privacy of his room, Robert began to harbor disturbing thoughts of how he could get rid of the source of his pain. He would sometimes imagine what life would be like without Emily, how things could return to normal, how he could regain control over the family dynamic. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he was justified in his anger. But despite his mounting frustration, Robert said nothing to anyone. He kept his feelings hidden, carefully masking his resentment beneath a facade of quiet indifference. Emily, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her brother, continued with her pregnancy preparations. She never suspected that her sibling, the person who had shared so much of her life, was capable of harboring such dangerous thoughts. While Emily and Mark continued to immerse themselves in the bliss of expecting their child, Robert's mental state deteriorated. He became consumed by a toxic cocktail of jealousy, neglect, and unresolved anger. It wasn't just the thought of sharing his parents' love that upset him, it was the deep, nagging belief that he had been replaced. And that thought, more than anything else, pushed Robert closer to the edge. The night that would forever change the Wheeler family began like any other. Mark and Emily had planned a quiet evening out, a small dinner at a local restaurant to celebrate the nearing arrival of their child. They were looking forward to a rare night away from the chaos of preparation. They left Robert alone at home, thinking he would spend the evening the way he usually did, locked in his room, engrossed in his thoughts or video games. But that evening, Robert's mind was far from calm. It had been building for months, a slow burn of anger, jealousy, and hurt. His thoughts had grown darker with each passing day, each moment where he felt invisible and abandoned by the people who were supposed to care for him. As Emily's belly grew and the excitement for the new baby reached its peak, Robert's resentment festered, and he couldn't bear it any longer. He was consumed with the idea that he had been forgotten, pushed aside by his own family. The thought of the baby arriving filled him with dread, and with it, the belief that he would never have his parents' love again. That night, Robert sat in his room, staring blankly at the walls. His mind raced, a tangled mess of emotions and thoughts. He knew that Emily was safe for the moment, but something inside him snapped. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that the only way to reclaim the attention he so desperately wanted was to get rid of the source of his pain, the baby. And the only way to do that was to hurt Emily. His anger had reached its boiling point, and he could feel the heat rising inside him. The idea, though horrifying, seemed logical to him now. In that moment, Robert wasn't just a teenage boy, he was someone who felt backed into a corner, someone who believed his only choice was to lash out. The baby, his sister, and his parents' love had all been taken from him, and he was willing to do anything to take it back. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, the cold steel feeling heavier in his hand than he had ever imagined. As he stood there, the weight of his decision began to sink in, but there was no turning back now. His mind was set. He crept through the darkened house, moving silently through the hallways, until he reached Emily's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see her sitting on the bed, reading a book, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Robert stood frozen for a moment, watching his sister, his feelings of anger mixing with a strange sense of guilt. He knew what he was about to do was wrong, but in that moment, all his emotions told him that it was the only way to end the suffocating feelings that had taken over his life. He stepped into the room, the knife in his hand gleaming under the soft light. Without warning, he lunged at Emily, the blade plunging into her side. She gasped in shock, her hands instinctively reaching for her stomach as the pain took over. The attack was swift and brutal, and in his rage, Robert continued to stab her repeatedly, each thrust of the knife driven by a deep, growing anger. Emily's screams filled the house, but there was no one around to hear them. The baby she carried, the life that had been the source of Robert's torment, was lost in the violence. When it was over, Robert stood over her lifeless body, breathing heavily, his heart racing. His mind was clouded with confusion and disbelief. He had crossed a line that he could never undo, but in his eyes it was too late to turn back. The twisted plan had been executed, and in that moment he felt both a rush of relief and a deep, unshakable sense of dread. As Robert left the room, he wiped the knife clean and placed it back in the kitchen drawer, as though nothing had happened. The house, once filled with excitement and dreams of a new life, was now eerily silent. Robert returned to his room, unaware of the reversible impact his actions had just set in motion. His parents would be returning soon, oblivious to the horror that had unfolded in their absence. The quiet town of Willow Creek would never be the same again. Detectives Miller and Harlow were called to the Wheeler household early the next morning as the news of Emily's brutal murder spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. The scene was chaotic, and the atmosphere in the home was tense. The smell of blood lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily's lifeless body was discovered by Mark and Emily's shocked and grief-stricken parents, who returned from their dinner to find their daughter's mutilated form in the living room. The house, once full of excitement, was now transformed into a grim crime scene. The detectives immediately set to work, methodically searching the house for clues that could explain the senseless act of violence. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no evidence of a struggle, just the body of Emily, lying lifeless on the floor. The brutality of the attack stood in stark contrast to the otherwise calm surroundings of the Wheeler home. It was as if a storm had passed through, leaving only destruction in its wake. The detectives first interviewed Mark and Emily's parents, who were in complete shock. They couldn't understand who would want to hurt Emily, let alone kill her. Both parents were convinced that no one had a motive to hurt their daughter, and they insisted that there were no signs of conflict within the family. Emily and Robert had always seemed to get along, with no history of violence or animosity, but the detectives weren't so sure. The lack of evidence pointing to any outside intruder raised suspicion, and the fact that Emily had been attacked in such a violent manner led them to believe the killer had to be someone close to the family. Their attention quickly turned to Robert. Though he was initially cooperative, his behavior struck Detective Miller as odd. Robert seemed calm, almost too calm for someone who had just lost a sibling. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, Robert claimed he had been in his room all evening, alone, and hadn't heard anything unusual. But there was something about his story that didn't sit right with the detectives. Robert's eyes were glazed over, and he spoke in a monotone, detached voice. It was as if he had rehearsed the answers, or worse, had no emotional connection to the tragic event at all. The detectives delved deeper into Robert's background, starting with his relationship with Emily. They discovered that Robert had been growing more withdrawn in recent months, spending more time in his room and avoiding family activities. Though outwardly polite, he had become increasingly distant, showing little interest in the excitement surrounding the baby. Detectives found it strange that Robert had never once expressed any joy about becoming an older brother. In fact, there were reports from friends and acquaintances who described his behavior as erratic, bordering on hostile when the subject of his parents' attention towards Emily came up. Detectives Miller and Harlow began to piece together a troubling narrative. Robert had been struggling with feelings of neglect and jealousy. As Emily's pregnancy progressed, Robert's sense of abandonment deepened. His resentment grew stronger as he felt pushed aside in favor of the new baby. There were even reports of him acting out in school and expressing frustration over his changing role in the family. The investigation took a shocking turn when detectives found a series of disturbing online searches on Robert's computer. He had been researching violent crimes, specifically how to carry out the perfect murder without getting caught. This discovery sent chills down the detectives' spines. It was clear now that Robert had been planning something dark for quite some time. His fixation on violence, combined with his growing resentment, painted a chilling picture of a teenager on the edge. Still, there was no direct evidence linking Robert to the crime, and he continued to deny any involvement. But as the detectives pressed him with more questions, Robert's demeanor began to shift. He became more agitated, his answers more inconsistent. Finally, after hours of questioning, Robert cracked. His cold, emotionless facade began to crumble, and he finally admitted to the crime. The confession sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Robert had brutally murdered his own sister in a fit of rage, consumed by jealousy and the overwhelming feeling of being forgotten by his parents. He admitted that the birth of the baby had been the final straw. And in his mind, killing Emily was the only way to reclaim the attention and love he felt he had lost. Robert's chilling confession revealed a level of darkness that no one had anticipated. The boy who had once been a quiet and seemingly harmless teenager had transformed into a killer, driven by an insidious combination of mental anguish, resentment, and a desperate need for control. As the investigation came to a close, it was clear that Robert's actions had been premeditated, a tragic culmination of a deep psychological struggle that had gone unnoticed by those closest to him. The horror of what had transpired in the Wheeler home would forever haunt the town of Willow Creek. As the trial approached, the residents of Willow Creek remained in a state of shock, unable to fully comprehend the extent of the tragedy that had unfolded in their quiet town. The news that Robert Wheeler had been charged with the brutal murder of his pregnant sister, Emily, seemed almost impossible to believe. The boy who had once been a seemingly normal teenager had shattered the fabric of his family in an unimaginable act of violence. But as the court proceedings began, more unsettling details of Robert's inner turmoil began to emerge, shedding light on the darkness that had consumed him. During the trial, Robert's defense attorney argued that he had been suffering from severe mental health issues, including depression and anxiety, which had been exacerbated by the stresses surrounding Emily's pregnancy. The argument was built around the idea that Robert had been unable to cope with the overwhelming feelings of neglect and jealousy that had taken root in his mind. According to the defense, Robert had never received the help he needed, and his deteriorating mental state had ultimately led him to commit the heinous act. The attorney painted a picture of a troubled teen who had felt increasingly abandoned by his parents, who were preoccupied with Emily's pregnancy and the arrival of the baby. In this narrative, Robert was portrayed not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a victim of his circumstances, a young man who had been failed by those closest to him. But the prosecution painted a much darker picture of Robert. They argued that his actions had been premeditated, and that his increasingly erratic behavior had been a clear sign of a deeper problem that had been ignored for far too long. The prosecution revealed that Robert had been researching violent crimes and ways to commit the perfect murder long before the night of Emily's death. This information sent ripples through the courtroom, as it became clear that Robert's descent into violence had not been a sudden, impulsive act, but something that had been carefully planned and executed. His cold, calculated behavior in the aftermath of the murder, returning to his room as if nothing had happened, washing the knife and placing it back in its drawer, showed a disturbing lack of remorse and an eerie sense of control. As the trial progressed, it became evident that Robert's mental health had been a ticking time bomb. His parents, overwhelmed by their excitement about the baby, had missed the warning signs of his growing emotional distress. Robert's isolation, his secretive behavior, and his increasingly aggressive outbursts were overlooked or dismissed as typical teenage rebellion. It wasn't until the tragedy occurred that the full extent of his internal struggle became clear. In a surprising twist, Robert's confession revealed a depth of emotion and pain that left the courtroom silent. He spoke of his feelings of being invisible, of the suffocating jealousy he felt toward his sister, and the way he believed that Emily's pregnancy had pushed him out of his parents' lives. He admitted that he had convinced himself that killing Emily was the only way to regain control of his family and the love he felt he had lost. He spoke of his frustration with being ignored, of the way his parents had unknowingly alienated him in their excitement for the baby. But as he recounted the events of that night, there was no sign of the remorse one might expect from someone who had just taken the life of their own flesh and blood. Instead, Robert's words were cold, almost detached, as if he were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. The jury deliberated for hours, weighing the evidence and Robert's mental state. Ultimately, Robert was convicted of first-degree murder, but the case didn't end there. The question of his mental health remained a key issue, with many questioning whether he truly understood the full extent of his actions. Some argued that Robert should have received psychiatric care years earlier, but that was now a moot point. The damage had been done. In the end, Robert was sentenced to life in prison, but the case remained a haunting reminder of how unchecked mental health issues, combined with feelings of neglect and isolation, can spiral into violence. His story became one of both personal tragedy and societal failure, a failure to recognize the signs of a troubled mind before it was too late. The Wheeler family, forever shattered, would never fully recover from the loss of Emily and the unborn child she carried. The town of Willow Creek, too, would never be the same. The tragic loss of a young woman, and the revelation of the darkness that had lived within her brother, left everyone questioning how they could have missed the signs of such a deep and dangerous descent.